My stepbrother cornered me while I was still grieving my stepfather's death, telling me to pack my bags, so I let him believe he'd won. I waited 4 days for the will reading, where I set a trap my stepfather and I had prepared years ago, one he never saw coming. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The silence in the house was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. It had been 4 days since we buried Andrew, my stepfather, the man who had raised me as his own since I was 10. Every object in the large, light-filled craftsman home we had shared, and in recent years, redesigned together, screamed his absence. The air was thick with it, heavy and suffocating. I was running on fumes, a hollowed-out version of myself, subsisting on weak tea and the sympathetic, pitying glances of neighbors. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest and stealing my breath, exacerbated by a migraine that had been pounding behind my eyes since the funeral. I was standing in the kitchen, staring blankly at a row of untouched condolence casseroles, when the back door slid open with a jarring rumble. I flinched, my hand flying to my chest. It was my stepbrother, Gavin. He hadn't bothered to knock. He never did. Gavin, Andrew's only biological son, was a man who moved through life as if he owned every space he entered. At 45, he still carried the brash, entitled energy of a college fraternity president, packaged in an expensive suit that strained slightly across his midsection. He managed a string of luxury car dealerships, and his personality was just as slick and overpriced. "Megan," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. He wasn't looking at me, but at the countertops, the custom cabinetry, his eyes scanning the room with a disturbing, appraising gleam. "We need to talk." I wrapped my robe tighter around myself. "Gavin, I can't, not right now. I'm not feeling well." "Yeah, well, this won't take long," he said, finally turning his gaze on me. His eyes were cold, flat, and utterly lacking the kindness that had defined his father. "Look, I know you're upset, but we need to be practical. Dad's gone. Things are going to change." I nodded numbly. "I know, the will reading is on Friday," Mr. Harrison said. Gavin let out a short, barking laugh. "The will? Right, that's just a formality, a T's and I's situation. Dad and I had an understanding. He promised me this house years ago." My blood, which had felt sluggish and cold, suddenly spiked with a hot, sharp fear. "What are you talking about? Andrew never said anything like that to me." "Why would he?" Gavin sneered, taking a step closer. He picked up an apple from the bowl on the counter, inspected it, and tossed it back with disinterest. "You're not his blood, Megan. You were. Well, you were his wife's kid. He was good to you, sure, but I'm his son. This house, the real assets, they come to me. It's the natural order of things." My head was pounding so hard I could barely see straight. "Gavin, this is my home. Andrew and we lived here. I took care of him here." "And I appreciate that," he said, the words sounding practiced and utterly insincere. "You played nurse. It was very sweet, but that's over now. The house is mine. I'm just giving you a heads up so you can get a move on." I swayed, gripping the edge of the granite counter. The stone felt cold, anchoring. "Get a move on? What? What are you saying?" "I'm saying," he said, his voice dropping to a low, impatient tone, "that I'm taking possession. My girlfriend Julia is already picking out paint swatches. We're going to list this place by the end of the month. It needs a lot of updates to get top dollar. So, start packing. I can give you a week, maybe 10 days out of respect for, you know." He gestured vaguely, as if Andrew's death were a minor inconvenience. I stared at him, the shock momentarily eclipsing my grief. He wasn't just grieving differently. He wasn't grieving at all. This was an eviction. He was kicking me out of my home, the home I had shared with the only father I'd ever known, the home I had meticulously helped design and care for, and he was doing it less than a week after the funeral. "You can't be serious," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm dead serious, Megan. It's mine now," he said, his eyes hardening. "Start packing." He turned and walked out, the screen door slamming shut behind him with a final, echoing crack. I was left alone in the crushing silence, the smell of stale coffee and funeral lilies filling my lungs. The migraine exploded behind my eyes, and for a moment I thought I would collapse. The cruelty of it, the sheer, naked avarice, was a second, brutal blow. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. The next 48 hours were a blur of cold dread. Gavin's words hung in the air, poisoning the atmosphere of the one place I'd felt safe. I drifted from room to room, touching the spines of Andrew's books, running my hand along the smooth oak of the banister he taught me to sand and varnish, seeing Gavin's smug, dismissive face at every turn. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old house made me jump, thinking he'd returned, perhaps with a moving truck this time. My profession as an architect meant I saw this house as more than just bricks and mortar. It was a living entity, a project of love between Andrew and me. He had bought it when it was a rundown shell, and over the past 2 decades, we had rebuilt it together. I'd drawn the plans for the new kitchen, sketching at the very table Gavin had leaned against. Andrew had taught me about structural loads and joinery, fostering my passion until it became my career. Every beam, every tile held a memory. The thought of Gavin and his girlfriend, Julia, splashing trend-right gray, paint over the warm, custom-mixed ochre Andrew, and I had spent a weekend perfecting made me physically ill. On Wednesday, 2 days before the will reading, the phone rang. It was Gavin. I stared at the caller ID, my heart hammering against my ribs. I let it ring 4 times before picking up. "Hello," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Megan, just calling to see how the packing is coming along," he said. His tone was breezy, as if he were asking about the weather. "I've got a guy coming on Saturday to change the locks, so I'm really going to need you to be cleared out by then." I sank onto the steps of the staircase, the phone cold against my ear. "Gavin, the will reading isn't until Friday. You don't know what it says. You have no legal right to do this." "Oh, come on, Megan, don't be naive. It's semantics. We both know what Dad wanted. He told me man to man." There was a pause, and I heard a woman's high-pitched laugh in the background. "Julia." "Look," he continued, "I'm trying to be the good guy here. I'm giving you a warning. Don't make this messy. It would be embarrassing for you." Messy, embarrassing for me. He was threatening me. He was trying to bully me out of my home before the legal process had even begun. A small, cold flicker of something other than grief sparked in my chest. It was anger. "I will be at Mr. Harrison's office on Friday, Gavin," I said, my voice a little stronger. "We will find out what Andrew's final wishes are then. Goodbye." I hung up before he could reply, my hand shaking, the sheer audacity of it. He was so certain, so arrogant. He saw me as a soft-willed, grieving woman he could simply push aside. He and his father had been cut from entirely different cloths. While Andrew was all quiet strength, humility, and meticulous planning, Gavin was a tidal wave of ego and shortcuts. He always had been. I stood up and walked to Andrew's study. The room was just as he'd left it, his reading glasses on top of a stack of blueprints, a faint scent of old books and the pipe tobacco he'd given up years ago, but that still clung to the curtains. My eyes landed on the heavy, fireproof document box tucked neatly under his desk. My mind flashed back to a conversation from 6 months ago, just after Andrew's final, devastating diagnosis. We were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. He'd been quiet for a long time before he turned to me, his eyes clear and sharp despite his illness. "I've made sure you'll be safe, Megan," he'd said, covering my hand with his. "I've taken care of everything. The paperwork is handled. Remember that." At the time, I dismissed it as the reassurances of a dying man, too lost in my anticipatory grief to parse his meaning. Now, his words echoed in my head with new significance. The paperwork is handled. Gavin was arrogant, he was loud, and he assumed everyone else was stupid. But Andrew had been quiet, precise, and brilliant. And Gavin, in his greedy haste, had forgotten one crucial thing. His father knew exactly who his son was. My relationship with Andrew was the cornerstone of my life. My own father had left before I had memories of him. My mother met Andrew when I was 9, and from the beginning, he had treated me not as a burden or an afterthought, but as a project to be cherished. He was a civil engineer, a man who believed in foundations, and he methodically built one for me. He taught me how to ride a bike, how to use a power drill, and most importantly, how to read a blueprint. When my mother passed away from a sudden illness during my first year of college, it was Andrew who held me together. He paid for my architecture degree, attended every awards ceremony, and was the first person to hire my fledgling firm to design a community park. My devotion to him was absolute. When he got sick 5 years ago, I moved back into the house without a second thought, converting my old bedroom into a studio so I could work from home and manage his care. The last 2 years were difficult. The strong, vibrant man I adored faded, becoming frail and dependent. I managed his medications, drove him to endless appointments, and held his hand through the long, painful nights. It was exhausting, heartbreaking work, but I would have done it for another 20 years if I could have. Gavin's involvement during this time was fleeting and disruptive. He lived 2 towns over, but his visits were rare, duty-bound, and always seemed to coincide with a request for money. He'd breeze in, smelling of expensive cologne, clap his father on the back, and then pull Andrew aside for a private chat that always left my stepfather looking tired and sad. Andrew had, on more than one occasion, bylaid Gavin out of a bad investment or a temporary cash flow problem at his dealership. "He just needs a little help to get on his feet," Andrew would say, though Gavin was well into his 40s. I held my tongue, but I saw the truth. Gavin was a leech, draining his father financially and emotionally. Gavin's girlfriend, Julia, was a perfect match for him. She was all sharp angles, from her pointed stilettos to her razor-cut bob, and her eyes held a similar acquisitive gleam. I'd met her only a handful of times, usually at holidays, where she'd made a show of assessing the house's value. "These original hardwood floors are fantastic," she'd cooed at Thanksgiving, her eyes scanning the living room. "This neighborhood has skyrocketed. You're sitting on a goldmine here, Andrew." Andrew had merely smiled politely and changed the subject, but I saw her. I saw her calculating the square footage, her gaze lingering on the silver and the artwork. She wasn't just an accessory to Gavin's greed, she was a partner in it. The day after Gavin's threatening phone call, they both showed up. I was in the kitchen, attempting to make soup, when their white luxury SUV pulled into the driveway. My stomach turned to ice. They didn't knock. Gavin used a key I didn't even know he had. "Megan, good you're here," he announced, as if he were the master of the house. Julia was at his side, holding a Starbucks cup and a clipboard. "Gavin, I told you to wait until Friday," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and rage. "We're just getting a head start," Julia said, her voice a sickly sweet syrup. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "There's just so much to do, and Gavin's on a timeline to get this on the market." She walked past me into the dining room. "This chandelier is horribly dated," I heard her murmur. "And this wallpaper? Yikes." Gavin followed her, gesturing expansively. "We'll gut this whole first floor. Open concept, that's what sells." They were talking about my home. My home. The home Andrew and I had poured our souls into. They were talking about it like it was a carcass to be butchered and sold for parts. "Get out," I said. They both stopped and looked at me. Gavin laughed. "Excuse me." "I said get out," I repeated, my voice louder now, vibrating with the force of my anger. "You are not welcome here. This is not your house. You have no right to be here, planning to destroy Andrew's home before he's even been gone a week." Gavin's smile vanished. His face darkened. "You're making a big mistake, Megan. You're getting hysterical. This is my house. Dad promised me. You're just the help, and the help services are no longer required." "Get out," I said one more time, pointing toward the door, "or I will call the police." Julia scoffed, but Gavin held up a hand, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Fine, be that way, play the grieving victim. But don't say I didn't warn you. Saturday, the locks are being changed, be out, or I'll be the one calling the police to have you removed for trespassing." He and Julia turned and walked out, their laughter echoing from the driveway. I collapsed against the wall, my legs giving out. The humiliation and rage were so potent I could taste them. But beneath the fear, That cold spark of anger was growing, coalescing into something hard and sharp. Resolve. He thought I was just the help. He thought I was a hysterical woman he could steamroll. He thought his father was a fool. He was wrong on all counts. And I suddenly knew, with absolute clarity, what I had to do. The moment their car peeled out of the driveway, the fog of grief and shock finally cleared, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. I was an architect. I dealt in plans, in structures, in foundations. Gavin's entire claim was built on sand, on a supposed promise from a man who was no longer here to refute it. My entire defense was built on what Andrew had taught me, the power of paperwork. I went straight to his study and knelt before the fireproof document box. My hands were steady as I entered the simple combination, my birthday. The lid hissed open. Inside, it was meticulously organized, just as I'd expected. Andrew was a man who labeled everything. There were files for appliance warranties, tax returns, and medical history. And then, at the very front, was a thick, navy blue binder I didn't recognize. The label on the spine was printed in Andrew's neat, all-caps block lettering, "The House." My heart began to beat a steady, heavy rhythm. This was it. This was what he'd meant. The paperwork is handled. I pulled the binder out and set it on the desk, opening it with a sense of reverence. It wasn't a will, it was a trust. My legal knowledge was specific. I was a paralegal who had spent a decade working in estate law before switching careers to architecture. I knew exactly what I was looking at. Years ago, long before his illness, Andrew had created an irrevocable living trust. He had funded it with a single asset, the house. The documents were all there, signed, notarized, and filed with the county. And the trust's instructions were simple and ironclad. Andrew was the grantor and the primary trustee for his lifetime. Upon his death, a successor trustee was named. I flipped the page, and my breath caught in my throat. Successor trustee, Megan S. Miller. Sole beneficiary, Megan S. Miller. I read it again, and then a third time. It wasn't a mistake. He had done this years ago, long before his final illness. He had legally and permanently removed the house from his personal ownership and placed it into a separate legal entity. It was no longer his to will to anyone. It wasn't part of his estate. It hadn't been for almost a decade. It was mine. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. This wasn't just a defense, it was a fortress. Andrew, in his quiet wisdom, had seen this coming. He had known his son's character, his entitlement, his greed. He had known Gavin would see the house as a payday, not a home. And he had protected me in the most permanent, legally binding way possible. The clever trap wasn't something I had to build. It was something Andrew had built for me, and I was simply the architect who knew how to read the plans. Gavin was operating on the assumption that the house was the primary asset in Andrew's will. He was planning to bully me, maybe even contest the will if it didn't give him what he wanted, banking on the idea that I was a grieving, emotional woman with no resources. He had no idea that the fight was already over before it began. The house was a separate issue entirely. I spent the next hour making copies of every single page. The trust document, the deed transfer, the county filing receipts. I put the originals back in the box and tucked the copies into my briefcase. Then I did something Andrew would have appreciated. I began my own investigation. I called Mr. Harrison, the executor. "Mr. Harrison, it's Megan Miller," I said, my voice calm and professional. "Megan, my dear, I'm so sorry for your loss. Andrew was a fine man. I'm glad you called. I assume you're ringing about the reading on Friday." "I am. I'll be there," I said. "But I have a specific, and perhaps unusual, question. I have in my possession a copy of the Andrew R. Keller Irrevocable Trust, dated." I read the date from the document. "I am named as the successor trustee and beneficiary. I just want to confirm that you are aware of this document's existence and that it supersedes any other claims on the property." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Mr. Harrison let out a low chuckle. "Ah, yes, I was wondering when you'd find that. Andrew was meticulous. Yes, Megan, I am very aware of the trust. It's perfectly executed. The house is, and has been for some time, not part of the probate estate. It is yours, free and clear. That's what I thought, I said, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled my knees. One more question. Gavin, Andrew's son, he seems to be under the impression the house is his. He's been here, telling me to move out. He what? Mr. Harrison's voice lost all its grandfatherly warmth, replaced by the sharp edge of a seasoned lawyer. He's telling you to vacate, before the will reading. He said he's changing the locks on Saturday. He claims Andrew promised him the house. Mr. Harrison was silent for another moment. Megan, this is very important. Do not tell him what you've found. Do not mention the trust. Let him come tea. Oh, my office on Friday. Let him operate under his assumptions. Andrew's will is, well, let's just say it was written with a very clear understanding of his son's nature. Gavin's behavior may have significant consequences for him. Just sit tight. And for God's sake, if he shows up again, call the police. I understand, I said. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. See you Friday, Megan, and well done. I hung up the phone, the last vestiges of fear replaced by a cold, hard certainty. Gavin wasn't just walking into a will reading. He was walking into a trap, and I was going to make sure the door snapped shut behind him. The next day, Thursday, was the final day of quiet. I spent it not in grief, but in preparation. I gathered my copies of the trust. I made a list of Gavin's actions, the initial threat, the phone call, the illegal entry with Julia, the threat to change the locks. It was a clear pattern of harassment and attempted illegal eviction. I was no longer a victim. I was a paralegal turned architect, and I was building a case. That evening, Gavin returned. This time, he brought a contractor. I saw them from the living room window, Gavin pointing at the porch, the contractor nodding and taking notes on a tablet. The audacity of it, the sheer, breathtaking disrespect, sent a shockwave of ice through my veins. I'd had enough. I grabbed my briefcase with the trust copies and walked out onto the front porch, pulling the door shut behind me. Gavin and the contractor both turned, surprised. Gavin, I said, my voice was even. No trembling, no tears. Megan, I told you I'd be busy today, he said, clearly annoyed at the interruption. This is Frank. He's going to be handling the remodel. We're just getting a jump on the estimates. Hello, Frank, I said, looking at the contractor. You should know that the man who hired you has no legal authority to do so. He does not own this property. Frank, a burly man in his 50s, looked from me to Gavin, his expression souring. What's she talking about, Mr. Keller? Gavin's face flushed a deep, ugly red. She's confused. Grief, you know, she was my dad's sort of caretaker. She's just upset about having to leave. I am not confused, Gavin, I said, holding his gaze. I'm an architect. I know this house better than you ever will. And as a former paralegal, I know estate law. You seem to be operating under a very large, very mistaken assumption. I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by his trademark bluster. What assumption is that? That my father would leave his son his house? That's not an assumption, Megan. That's a fact. Now, if you'll excuse us, Frank and I are busy. Gavin, I said, my voice sharp, stopping him as he tried to turn away. You really should attend the will reading tomorrow before you make any more plans. You might find it educational. This was the first strategic reveal. I was letting him know that I knew something, that I wasn't the passive, grieving woman he'd dismissed. He narrowed his eyes. What did you do? Did you find some later will? Did you get him to sign something when he was sick? His mind immediately went to fraud, to the very thing he himself was projecting. You won't get away with it. I'll have the best lawyers in the state. I'll tie this up in court for years. Is that a threat, Gavin? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Because it sounds like you're planning to contest the will before you even know what's in it. Mr. Harrison might find that interesting. Gavin's entire demeanor shifted. The mention of the lawyer, combined with my sudden confidence, threw him off balance. He knew who Mr. Harrison was, Andrew's lawyer for 30 years, a sharp, no-nonsense man. You don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his poorly executed threat dissolving. "You're just trying to bluff." "Am I?" I gave him a small, cold smile. "We'll see tomorrow, won't we? 10 a.m., don't be late." I then turned to the contractor. "Frank, I'd strongly advise you not to accept any deposits from this man regarding this property. He has no legal standing. You'd just be setting yourself up for a lawsuit." Frank's eyes widened. He looked at Gavin, then at me, then back at Gavin. "You know what? I think I'll wait until the paperwork is settled. I'll send you an email, Mr. Keller." He didn't wait for a reply, just packed up his tablet and walked quickly back to his truck. Gavin was left standing on the lawn, his face a mask of fury, and for the first time, uncertainty. "You're going to regret this, Megan," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "No, Gavin," I said, turning to go back inside. "I think you are." I closed the door, my heart pounding, but not with fear. It was the adrenaline of a fight I knew I was about to win. I had shattered his perception. I had revealed, just for a moment, the steel beneath the grief. His threats were hollow, his ease were obvious, and he had just confirmed his fraudulent nature to a third-party witness. The trap was set. All he had to do was walk into it. Gavin's confidence had been shaken, but his desperation only made him more reckless. That night, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Is this Megan Miller?" a woman's voice asked. It was sharp, unpleasant. "Who is this?" "This is Julia, Gavin's girlfriend." Her voice was dripping with condescension. "Listen, I don't know what little game you think you're playing, but you need to stop. Gavin is a good man, and he's been through a lot, his father's death. It's been so hard on him." I was so stunned by the hypocrisy I almost laughed. "Has it?" "Yes, and you threatening him, trying to steal what is rightfully his. It's disgusting. Andrew promised him that house. Gavin is his son. What are you? You're nothing. You're just the hired help who overstayed her welcome. You should be grateful for what Andrew did for you, not try to steal from his family the second he's gone." "Julia," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You and Gavin entered my home without permission. You threatened to have me thrown out. You are harassing me. I highly recommend you stop. And I'll see Gavin at the lawyer's office tomorrow." "You think you're so smart," she spat. "Gavin's already talking to his own lawyer. We know about people like you. You prey on old, sick men. We're going to prove you manipulated him. You'll end up with nothing. You'll be lucky if you don't end up in jail." She hung up. The call was a desperate, clumsy attempt to regain control, to frighten me back into the box he'd put me in. It did the opposite. It was more evidence. I wrote down the time of the call and a summary of her threats. The investigation was already complete. The case was already built. But Gavin and Julia were actively adding to my file. The full, shocking extent of their deception wasn't some hidden history. It was happening in real time. They were so blinded by their own greed that they were providing me with a perfect, real-time record of their malice. Gavin was struggling with his loyalty, not to his father's memory, but to his own fantasy. He had convinced himself of a reality, that he was the rightful heir, the prince who was owed the kingdom, and he was defending that fantasy against all evidence. My newfound confidence was, in his mind, the final, desperate act of a cornered interloper. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Andrew's study, the navy blue trust binder open on the desk. I didn't need to reread it. I just needed to sit with it. I felt Andrew's presence in the room, his quiet, steady strength. He had known this would happen. He had known his son's character so perfectly that he had orchestrated this entire event from beyond the grave. The second confrontation wasn't with me, it was with himself. Gavin's bluster, his threats, his girlfriend's nasty phone call, it was all the sound of a man desperately trying to convince himself he was in the right. He was fighting a war against a ghost, and the ghost had already won. I arrived at Mr. Harrison's office at 9:45 a.m., 15 minutes early. The office was on the top floor of an old brick building, filled with mahogany furniture and the hushed, expensive silence of old money and older law. Mr. Harrison greeted me with a sad, kind smile. "Megan, please come in. Can I get you some coffee?" "I'm fine, thank you," I said, taking a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his large desk. "I received a frantic call from Gavin last night," Mr. Harrison said, sitting down. "He seems to believe you have somehow unduly influenced his father." "He's been making a lot of accusations," I said, placing my briefcase on my lap. "Yes, well," Mr. Harrison steepled his fingers. "Andrew was a very, very smart man. He was also my friend. He saw this coming a mile away, Megan. He prepared for it." He gestured to a stack of files on his desk. "The will is quite specific, and it's ironclad." At precisely 10:00 a.m., the door opened, and Gavin and Julia strode in. They were dressed in what I assumed was their version of power attire. Gavin wore his sharpest suit, and Julia was in a severe black dress, her arms crossed, looking as though she'd come to watch an execution. "Mr. Harrison," Gavin said, nodding curtly. He completely ignored me. "Gavin MS." Harrison glanced at Julia. "Julia Peters," she said. "I'm here for Gavin." "Ms. Peters, this is a private will reading, for family members named in the document only," Mr. Harrison said, his voice polite but firm. "I'm his partner," Julia snapped. "I'm here to support him." "Gavin," Mr. Harrison raised an eyebrow. Gavin looked at Julia, then at the lawyer. "She stays, or I walk." Mr. Harrison sighed. "Very well, as long as you understand this is highly irregular, please sit." They took the two other chairs. The air in the room was electric with tension. Gavin was vibrating with a smug, aggressive energy. He believed this was his moment of triumph, the part where I was exposed as a fraud and he was handed the keys to the kingdom. He thought I was bluffing. He had no idea I wasn't even the one holding the cards. Andrew was. Mr. Harrison put on his reading glasses and picked up the top file. "We are gathered for the reading of the last will and testament of Andrew R. Keller. I am the executor. The will is straightforward, and I will read it in its entirety." He began to read. The room was deathly quiet, broken only by the dry, precise rustle of paper. He went through the standard legal declarations, confirming Andrew's sound mind and his wish for this to be his final testament. "First," Mr. Harrison read, "I bequeath my collection of vintage maps and my 1968 Triumph convertible to my dear friend, Michael Sullivan. Next, I bequeath my workshop tools and my fishing equipment to my neighbor, Sam Jenkins." I saw Gavin shift in his chair. This was chump change. He was waiting for the real assets. "To my stepdaughter, Megan S. Miller," Mr. Harrison continued, and I felt Gavin's eyes bore into the side of my head. "I bequeath my personal library of architecture and engineering books and the entirety of my stock and investment portfolio, valued at approximately $215,000. Julia let out a small, sharp gasp. Gavin's head snapped toward me, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. $200,000, to me. "And finally," Mr. Harrison said, his voice steady, "to my son, Gavin M. Keller." Gavin sat up, leaning forward. His knuckles were white where he gripped the arms of the chair. This was it. "I bequeathed the sum of $50,000. Silence. Gavin just stared. He looked at Harrison, then at me, then back at Harrison. The smugness was gone, replaced by a baffled, slack-jawed expression. That's it," Gavin finally sputtered. $50,000, what about the rest? What about the house?" Mr. Harrison slowly took off his glasses. He folded them and placed them on the desk. "Gavin, the house is not, and has not been for many years, part of your father's estate. It was not his to bequeath in his will." "What are you talking about?" Gavin yelled, jumping to his feet. "He promised me. That house is worth over $1 million. He promised me." "A verbal promise, even if it were made, is not legally binding, Gavin," Mr. Harrison said, his voice turning to ice. "And in this case, it's irrelevant. Your father was a meticulous planner. 10 years ago, he created an irrevocable trust. He funded that trust with the house. In essence, he gave the house away 10 years ago, so it could not be part of any probate proceedings. Gavin looked completely lost. Trust. What trust? Who? Who did he give it to? Mr. Harrison slid a single, bound document across the desk. It was an identical copy of the navy blue binder from Andrew's study. He placed it in the Andrew R. Keller Trust. Upon his death, the trust names a single successor trustee and sole beneficiary. Gavin's eyes darted between the lawyer and me, a dawning, sickening horror spreading across his face. "You," he whispered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "It's you, isn't it? He gave it to her." "Megan Miller is the sole beneficiary of the trust," Mr. Harrison confirmed. "The house is hers, Gavin. It has been, by law, her property since the moment of your father's passing. Your claims to it are, and have always been, baseless." "No," Gavin roared, slamming his fist on the desk. "No, I won't accept this. He was sick. She manipulated him. She poisoned him against me. I'll fight this. I'll see you in court. I'll take everything." Julia, who had been silent, finally spoke, her voice a low hiss. "You'll never get away with this, you little." "That is quite enough," Mr. Harrison said, his voice suddenly booming in the small office. He stood up, towering over them. "Sit down, Gavin." Gavin, stunned by the lawyer's force, slowly sank back into his chair. Mr. Harrison picked up the will again. "You see, Gavin, your father knew you. He knew exactly who you are, which is why he included one final stipulation. Page 4, paragraph 3, the no contest clause." He cleared his throat and read, "Should any beneficiary of this will, either directly or indirectly, contest its validity, challenge any of its provisions, or attempt to seize or claim assets not specifically bequeathed to them, their inheritance shall be immediately nullified, and they shall receive nothing." Gavin's face went white. Mr. Harrison continued, "Furthermore, there is an addendum, a notarized letter from your father, which I have been instructed to read." He picked up another sheet of paper. "Gavin, if you are hearing this, it is because you have behaved exactly as I feared you would. You have shown my daughter, Megan, nothing but greed and contempt. You valued my house, but never the home we built. You saw your inheritance as a prize to be won, not a gift to be grateful for. The $50,000 was a final test, a test of your character, a test I see you have failed." G. Ewan was barely breathing. Mr. Harrison placed the letter down. "Gavin, you threatened Ms. Miller. You tried to illegally evict her from her own home. You brought third parties onto her property to plan its demolition. You have, in no uncertain terms, attempted to seize or claim assets not specifically bequeathed to you. By your own actions over the last 4 days, you have forfeited your $50,000 inheritance. You get nothing." The public humiliation was total. It wasn't just that he'd lost. It was the systematic, calm, and total exposure of his greed, all orchestrated by the father he had so fatally misjudged. Gavin just stared, his mouth opening and closing, no sound coming out. Julia was the one who finally broke. "This is insane. You people, you conspired against him." It was in that moment that I finally spoke. I turned in my chair and looked at Gavin, my voice as calm and clear as the morning air. "You made a huge mistake, Gavin," I said. "You saw me as the help. You saw your father as a fool. You were wrong. This is my house. And you have been harassing me. You have been trespassing." I looked at Mr. Harrison, then back at Gavin. "In fact," I said, my voice hardening, "you need to vacate immediately." The downfall was swift and absolute. Gavin sat frozen in the chair, his face a mottled, pale gray. The man who had strode in like a conqueror looked like a burst balloon, empty, limp, and discarded. Julia, seeing her golden goose payday evaporate, stood up abruptly. I have to go," she muttered, not even looking at Gavin, and hurried out of the office, her heels clicking angrily on the marble floor. She didn't look back. Gavin was left alone, utterly defeated. Mr. Harrison, his face grim, slid a business card across the desk. "I believe you'll be needing your own legal counsel, Gavin. I, however, represent Andrew's estate and, by extension, Ms. Miller's interests as trustee. I expect you'll return the key to her house, which I now know you possess illegally, by the end of the day. If you or any of your associates set foot on her property again, she will be filing for a restraining order, and I will be supporting her." Gavin finally moved. He stood up slowly, like an old man. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the lawyer. He just stared at the empty space where Julia had been. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the office, a man who had just lost his father, his inheritance, and his future, all in the span of 10 minutes. After the door closed, I let out a breath I felt I'd been holding for a week. Mr. Harrison sat down and poured me a glass of water from a carafe on his desk. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, Megan. Andrew, he wanted you to be secure, but I think he also wanted his son to have one final chance to do the right thing. It's a tragedy that he didn't take it." "He never would have," I said softly, my hands still shaking. "But, thank you, Andrew." That afternoon, a courier delivered a small, padded envelope to the house. Inside, with no note, was the key Gavin had used. The reconciliation wasn't with a person, but with my home. The silence that had been so loud and suffocating was now just quiet. It was peaceful. I walked through the rooms, no longer seeing Gavin's shadow or hearing Julia's sneering voice. I saw Andrew grilling on the back porch. I saw myself drafting plans at the kitchen table. I saw the life we had built. I used a small portion of the inheritance Andrew had left me to set up a charitable fund in his name at the local engineering college, creating a scholarship for students from single-parent homes, a nod to our own family. It felt right. It felt like something he would have done. As for Gavin, his downfall was not just financial. His desperate, baseless legal challenges went nowhere. No lawyer would take his case against an ironclad, irrevocable trust. His bluster had cost him $50,000 and any last shred of dignity. I heard through the grapevine that his performance at the car dealership, already suffering from his creative financing, took a nosedive. Without his father's money to bail him out, his temporary cash flow problems became permanent. He lost his job, and Julia, unsurprisingly, was long gone. The last I heard, he was living in a rented apartment, his luxury SUV repossessed. He had made his huge mistake. He had assumed, he had bullied, and he had forgotten the most important rule: never underestimate a quiet man's love for his daughter, and never ever underestimate the woman who knows how to read the blueprints. I was finally, truly safe. The paperwork, just as Andrew had promised, was handled.